Kæru stúdentar og starfsfólk, það mér mikil ánægja að setja Kennslumálanefnd Háskóla Íslands sem nú haldið 3. árið í röð. And I'd like to extend a special welcome to Professor Norman Sharp and thank him for being here today. We're delighted. Að þinginu standa Stúdentaráð, Kennslumálanefnd, gæðanefnd og kennslumiðstöð og ég vil færa einlægar þakkir fyrir þeirra vandaða undirbúning. Fyrsta málþing í þessari röð var haldið árið 2012 og þar var fjallað áherslur í stefnu Háskóla Íslands 2011 til 2016 á sviði náms og kennslu. Þingið í fyrra var helgað fjölbreyttum kennsluháttum og nýrri tækni. Og markmið í dag að ræða hvernig við getum nýtt gæðamat til að efla með skipulögum hætti gæði háskólastarfsins samanber yfirskrift þingsins. Það óhætt að segja að gæðamál náms og kennslu hafi verið í brennidepli á síðustu misserum. Það urðu ákveðin þáttaskil árið 2011 þegar stjórnvöld settu á laggirnar gæðaráð íslenskra háskóla, skipað 6 erlendum sérfræðingum. Og gæðaráðið setti fram svo nefnda rammaáætlun eflingu gæða á sviði æðri menntunar á Íslandi, sem kveður meðal annars á að á 5 ára fresti fari fram kerfisbundið mat á gæðum háskólastarfs á Íslandi. Og matið felst annars vegar í innra sjálfsmati á faglegri starfsemi háskólanna og hins vegar á ytra mati gæðaráðsins. Og það rík áhersla lögð á þátttöku stúdenta og að vinnan sé umbóta miðuð. Og fyrsta lota ramma áætlunarinnar núna rúmlega hálfnuð og á vettvangi Háskóla Íslands að þá hefur þetta verið skipulagt þannig að allar 25 deildir skólans og 2 þverfræðilegar námsleiðir fara í gegnum umfangsmikið sjálfsmat, auk þess sem Háskóli Íslands verður metinn í heild næsta vetur. Dagskrá kennslumálaþingsins að þessu sinni verður helguð gæðamati, einkum sjálfsmati og þeim lærdómum sem draga má af því. Meðal fyrirlesara Norman Sharp, prófessor, formaður gæðaráðs háskóla hér á Íslandi. Hann starfaði árabil sem prófessor í hagfræði áður en hann var forstöðumaður skosku gæðamatsstofnunarinnar QAA Scotland, sem stendur fyrir Quality Assurance Agency for Higher Education Scotland. Þar sem hann þróaði aðferðafræði við gæðamat á háskólastarfi sem byggir á þeirri hugmynd að flétta saman gæðatryggingu, gæðaeflingu og virkaþátttöku stúdenta. Og á síðustu árum að þá hefur þessi nálgun hlotið vaxandi vinsælda víða lönd og leyst af hólmi skrifræðislegar aðferðir við gæðamat í háskólastarfi. Norman, as you could probably perceived, I was mentioning you and your background very briefly and your leadership in developing new and effective quality assurance framework mechanisms for higher education. And may I repeat my thanks to you for taking time to be here today. We're all looking very much forward to hearing your talk. Góðir gestir, leið og ég býð Guðrúnu Geirsdóttur, forstöðumann Kennslumiðstöðar, að taka við stjórn. Að þá vil ég lýsa þeirri ósk að þingi verði okkur hvatning til að vinna skipulega úr þeim fjölda ábendinga sem koma fram í sjálfsmatsskýrslum og öðru gæðamati. Og ég hef heyrt frá einstaka einingum hvernig þær eru að vinna því að setja fram aðgerðaráætlun umbótaverkefni í kjölfar gæðamatsins og ég treysti að þetta verði almennt verklag. Við verðum að tryggja að öll vinnan sem lögð hefur verið fram af hálfu starfsfólks og stúdenta nýtist, fara ekki ofan í skúffu. Þetta verkefni sem að okkur ætlað að vinna af hálfu stjórnvalda og gríðarlega mikilvægt að við notum þetta til þess að bæta og breyta. Og það alveg augljóst að það margt sem rótast upp í sjálfsmatinu sem kostar peninga að laga og margt af því verður auðvitað bíða, en það líka margt sem ekki kostar peninga að laga. Það hugvitið og viljinn til að breyta. Og þannig getum við notað þessa vinnu til framþróunar og til þess að verulega efla gæði náms og kennslu. Bestu þakkir.
Komið sæl, Guðrún Geirsdóttir heiti ég og hin nýja Flutt, formaður Stúdentaráð sem átti að stýra hér dagskrá í dag, liggur því miður lasin heima, biður fyrir kveðjur og ég þurfti að hlaupa í skarðið. Og ég vona ég svona standi mig jafnvel og hún myndi líklega að gera. En verði velkomin á þetta þing. Ég búin að vera að sveifla símanum mínum bara rétt til að minna ykkur á að slökkva á símanum, fékk hérna aðstóð formanns kennslumálanefndar áðan til að setja minn á víbring og fleiri geta þá gert það eða slökkt alveg. Og mig langar að fyrsta dagskrá Normannsjarp sem að Kristi rektor hefur kynnt alveg ágætlega og hann fyrrum formaður gæðaráðs í Skotlandi og núverandi formaður gæðaráðs háskólana hérlendis og sérstakur fengur að fá hann. Það sem ég finnst gott við Normannsjarp, það margt gott við, a lot of good ideas and qualities. En það sem ég finnst þykir einna vænstum í hans máli og hans verkum og það sem hann hefur lagt áherslu á mikilvægi þess að hlusta á rödd stúdenta í öllu skólastarfi og að þeir séu kjarninn í öllu háskólastarfi og megi aldrei gleymast. Og ég sérstaklega þess vegna ánægð að fá hann hingað því þetta þing akkurat umræðu vettvangur nemenda og kennara og þeir ekkert svo margir þeir umræðu vettvangar þannig að ég mjög hamingjusum að sjá svona marga mæta hér í dag til að taka þátt í umræðum. Normannsjarp, we are very, very pleased to have you here and I will open up your overheads and welcome you here to the podium. Okay, welcome.
Thank you very much. I apologise, I cannot speak to you in Icelandic. I would try, but I know I would fail so badly. So I'm afraid you're stuck with this slightly strange Scottish English. It's a great pleasure to be here. I always love coming to Iceland. I particularly love coming to the University of Iceland. Why? Because I always go away with far, far more than I bring. And I mean that very genuinely. And for that reason, I'm always slightly nervous at speaking to a gathering such as this. My wife always tells me that she can tell what kind of mood I'm in by what tunes I'm humming to myself in the morning. And I lie not. I found myself as I was putting my tie on this morning, humming away, and I thought, what's that I'm humming? And it was the Dies Iris from the Rufli Requiem, the Day of Judgment. So I must indeed be very concerned about today. This is a great conference. It's a wonderful turnout. Thank you very much for taking the time not to hear me, but to participate in the morning's conference. It's a wonderful programme. I genuinely have not seen such an innovative programme in learning and teaching in higher education. To focus it around videos of students and I assume they're all genuine videos. You haven't had actors playing the part of students, just saying the things you want to hear. I assume they are genuine students, genuinely reflecting on their experience. And I'm just sorry that I would love to stay and could stay, but I would gain nothing from the Icelandic conversations. But I will make a point of talking with Magnus afterwards to find out all about it. What I would like to do in the next half hour is really to go through a bit of a journey, and probably not very much of this will be new to you. Probably you're very well aware of all of this, and indeed I'm sure that is the case. But I thought it was quite useful just to bring some of these things together as a background reminder, putting it in the front of our minds as you engage in the discussion for the rest of the morning, and then hopefully take the outputs from that discussion through into practice over the years to come. I sent Magnus a draft of what I was going to say about a week ago and asked him for feedback, and he said, well, that looks okay, but don't go on about the quality enhancement framework. We've all heard about it. We don't want to hear any more about it. So I'd like to start by quoting from the handbook for the quality enhancement framework. Just very briefly, if I may, I apologise, Magnus, just very briefly. The beginning of the handbook lays out some principles. And you're fed up with hearing me saying this before. The principles are the most important things. We can change all sorts of other things, but we can't change principles, I don't think. And if you don't have principles, I think we're wasting our time. And I think that's probably a problem with quite a lot of quality assurance arrangements throughout Europe and indeed wider internationally. They respond to whims either of government or other pressure groups in society, and they move about continually over the years. And that is the history of quality assurance arrangements. One of the most important principles, and I'm not just saying this because of the topic of the presentation, is the involvement of students. And that's the wee bit I would like to start by quoting. A defining feature of higher education, we say, is its relationship with the boundaries of knowledge. Students, through their higher education experience, discover how knowledge has been created and continues to evolve. Students become actively involved in knowledge creation, rather than simply being passive recipients of facts that they are required to repeat on demand at assessment. This provides graduates with the basis for continuing to learn and develop throughout their lives. Factual knowledge quickly becomes obsolete. Understanding lays the basis for reformulation, adaptation, and continuation of learning throughout life. The nature of learning in higher education fundamentally involves students as partners in the learning process. Given the centrality of this partnership, it's important to involve students also within our quality framework as active participants in the assurance and enhancement of their learning. Students are not the objects of the QEF, they are intrinsically partners within the endeavour. And I think that is our most important principle. And really what I want to do in my 28 minutes now is really to extemporise on that, to broaden out and to discuss with you the background to why I think that is so important. I'd like to take you through the foothills, just very, very briefly, of the nature of learning in higher education, how we manage that, the importance of supporting student engagement, whatever we mean by that, what the different elements of that are, what are some of the characteristics of effective student engagement, and then try and draw some some conclusions from that. So that's our journey for the next wee while. The hard questions to answer are always the very easy questions to ask, as I'm sure you're all aware. One of the hardest is when someone says, well, what do you mean by high quality teaching in higher education? And a writer I often quote in these contexts is Biggs, and from his, I think, still excellent wee book on teaching for quality learning at university. And Biggs talks about the defining feature of quality learning is the engagement of students in the very processes by which knowledge is created. Students, even first-year students, should be exposed, he argues, to the very temporary nature of knowledge. Our understanding of the world and our own particular academic disciplines has reached its current knowledge through a whole process of knowledge creation. The process continues over time, will go on continuing after we're long dead and buried. And the frontiers will move way beyond what we currently understand. And this is true whether we're economists, philosophers, scientists, medics. The thing that changes all the time, or the thing that is different between all of these disciplines, is the method of discovery. It is not the fundamental process itself. And that very simple premise about the temporary nature of knowledge lies at the very heart of what we refer to as research-led teaching. It's that that really defines us as a higher education institution. That is what marks off what you do in the University of Iceland from other kinds of educational institution. It's this engagement with the temporary nature of knowledge, with the working at the frontiers of knowledge, and working with students who will become part of that journey and go on being lifelong learners. We hear in different language often, reading between the words and reading between the lines. That is not only what we claim we are doing, it is what others actually demand of us. You sometimes get it expressed in very, very funny ways. You will hear employers sometimes talk very sadly of the need for the dreadful expression, oven-ready graduates. They want graduates that they can put in the lines of production, whatever that these lines are, and they can go to it from day one. But on more serious discussion with them, they will quickly say that it's not only what they can do in day one, but on day 365, and after 5 years, and after 10 years, that is actually important. It is about recreating the processes that they're engaged in for tomorrow, not for today. There is a lovely expression, I think, from Athens University after a meeting of the Coimbra group, which is a group of international leading universities that describe themselves as leading research universities. And at the close of this meeting, Athens University put out a statement about their approach to teaching. And you can read it for yourselves. A scientist who graduates from university must not be restricted to a speedy acquisition of skills, but should possess the characteristics of a mature scientist who, apart from knowledge in the area in which he or she has been trained, must also possess the philosophical approach of his or her science and the educational perceptions of society, which I think is a wonderful statement of what we are all about. Well, if that is the case, what is the basis of this lifelong learning? And Biggs talks about it, and you're all familiar with it, with this notion of deep and surface learning. And surface learning encourages our students simply to memorise, to identify things, to name things, to paraphrase, to enumerate and describe. And that is not really what we're about in higher education. Although, if I reflect back, I would have to say, on some of the essays I used to set my students, or exam questions I used to set them, or projects, it was very often actually about summarising things and making sure that they had memorised things. It's very easy to slip into that. But on the other hand, actually, what we are interested in is the deep learning, which is characterised by reflection, applying to novel problems, hypothesising, relating new information to principles, arguing, comparing and contrasting different perspectives, and so on. That is the stuff of a genuinely higher education. And if that's what we're about, what does that tell us then about our approach to teaching and managing learning? And again, I think Biggs is quite helpful in this context. I mean, he's summarising lots of other work that's going on. When he says, it's helpful just to think of what he sees as a sort of 3 stages that very often academics go through in the development of their approach to learning and teaching. And the first stage is really to see themselves as the sage on the stage. And these are caricatures, of course they are, but seeing people as, or the academics rather, as focusing very much on preparing excellent lectures, excellent handouts, and delivering these lectures as effectively as they can. If the students don't learn, it's their fault. They're ill-prepared, they're lazy, they're not bothering themselves, and so on. It's nothing to do with us. That was an excellent lecture. It's their fault. It's their fault. And of course, if that is what we're thinking about, then if we're thinking of quality assurance, then it would be about quality assuring the transmission. Is somebody speaking clearly? Can they hear them? And these are the things that training courses for new academics would be designed to help with. And indeed, I remember some of my very early training that I got sent on at my first academic post. Indeed, I was given an elocution teacher. It was felt I was not speaking quite clearly enough. My accent was perhaps just slightly too west of Scotland. But then it moves from that, according to Biggs. And the second approach is the toolbox approach. As we become more sophisticated, we think of the toolbox. And the toolbox is thinking of using different kinds of tools to aid teaching and learning. And so staff get exposed to different tools. A tool 10 years ago or something of PowerPoint when it came out at first. And I don't know if you remember some of the PowerPoint presentations that you maybe sat through, or horror of horrors, gave 10 years ago, when you had all these fancy things that you could never do with an overhead projector, but you could have things flashing in and out, you could have people walking across the slide, you could have things going in and out of focus, and you get these presentations, you came out and think, what the heck was that all about? You had no idea. But that was about enabling good teaching, the management of good learning. Give staff toolboxes. And if there's a problem with quality, then you need to improve what's in the toolbox. You need to expose staff to more tools. And again, I remember that same training experience I was sent on. One of the first lectures that was given on it was somebody who used the very expression of they hoped over the course of this course, this instruction, that they would give us an effective toolbox. And I thought, being first year into lecturing, I thought, toolbox, jinx, I'm just scared I run out of material before the end of the hour. That's all. I just want to make sure I've got enough notes to last an hour. What's this about a toolbox? So the toolbox I soon learned, and that was the second stage. But Biggs's third stage, the mature stage of managing learning, is to rethink actually what it's about, and think in terms of the partnership between the teacher and the student as a partnership in learning, a partnership in the creation of the student's knowledge. And the focus becomes not a focus on teaching, but on learning. It's on what the student does in order to master the learning. Now, from that perspective, of course, students need to have access to the appropriate materials. They need to be appropriately prepared. And the role of the academic is absolutely vital in this. The academic is there to help the student to manage the learning experience. But giving a good lecture, per se, is probably a necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition for learning. How often do we come out of a lecture thinking, well, I've had both, and I'm sure you have too, both experiences. One thinking, that was pretty good, Norman. That actually was okay for a change. That was not too bad. And you can go and have a coffee and feel quite good about yourself. It doesn't happen very often, but occasionally. But then in tutorials you talk to your students and you think, actually, they hadn't understood that. All of these pearls of wisdom and wee jokes, they hadn't understood what that was about. And vice versa. You sometimes come out thinking, that was a real dog's breakfast. I really confused myself over that. But surprisingly, by exposing your students to sort of thinking through these problems and why you were struggling with it, they also will struggle with it and will struggle alongside you to deepen their knowledge and their understanding. So our task, according to Biggs, is to create a context where deep learning can take place. And if we're going to achieve this, we need to achieve what the jargon talks about in terms of a constructive alignment. And I think we are very fortunate in the University of Iceland, and indeed some of our other sister institutions around the island. It's very hard if you are trying to develop partnerships within your tutorial rooms, within your bailiwick of the institution. If the institution at large is run on a highly dictatorial basis, where students have their place, and their place is not to ask questions, but to be good, obedient students, that does not work. That clash of cultures does not work. Biggs's constructive alignment is talking about an alignment of the curriculum, the delivery of the curriculum, the structures of the university, the senior management of the university, the governance of the university, in an open and constructive way that embraces students as partnerships in the whole endeavour. And again, I apologise for the jargon, but a wee bit of the jargon is our university moves from being a teaching institution to a learning institution, from a teaching paradigm to a learning paradigm. And there are many different aspects to that shift. It's a very major shift from the teaching institution to learning institution. And my final bits and pieces of this is to turn to the area of student engagement. If we are going to seriously engage our students, what actually does that mean? And that's not an easy question to answer. And there actually, to my knowledge, there are no clear answers to that just now. When I was still working with QAA in Scotland, we had talked for a few years about the importance of student engagement with all of our principals and vice principals academic, without really addressing the question. We pretended we knew what it meant. But at one meeting, somebody asked the question, well, what actually do we mean by student engagement and effective student engagement? And that is actually quite difficult. And as I said to some of you before, at that point, we then went away for a week with all of the senior vice principals from our 13 universities, and we spent the week in Canada looking at some examples of what we were being told were good examples of student engagement, and talking amongst ourselves about what that actually meant. And it was interesting, the answers that came back. In some cases, when we talked to groups of students and asked them about in what ways they felt engaged with their institution, a surprising number came up with what they did in voluntary societies. They worked in the community. They represented the university in working with old people, with disadvantaged groups of various different kinds in the community. And that was very important to them. Or in one case, a university which was all residential had arranged its floors in residences in different ways. In some of the floors, it was arranged by faculty, so that if you were studying pure sciences, you would get a bedroom on floors 6 and 7. And you knew that everyone round about you was also studying sciences. And they saw that as being very important. Or in other floors were reserved for people with particular interests. There was a floor reserved, for example, people interested in music. And that formed a kind of society. So it was a way of plugging in. People, students themselves, plugging into the institution. In other cases, a university, a new university, it was at a time when the Canadians had lots of money, a new university had just been built and decided it was going to dispense totally with lectures and everything would be done using IT. And the presentation we were giving talked about the importance of plugs in forming wee communities. I've got to be careful how I pronounce this. Plug huggers. And sure enough, when you walked around the corridors of the university, you had these wee clusters of students all round the plugs, plugging the laptops in. And they sat and, we were told, talked about what they were being asked to do, the material they were being presented with, and so on. So, I mean, these are slightly peripheral examples, but nonetheless, what was interesting to us was what we thought of as being at the periphery of things. Because we're very self-centred. We think we're at the centre of things. The academics are at the centre of things. But actually, in some instances, we're actually not. And I thought that was very interesting. But moving beyond that kind of slightly surface element, one of my pleasures just now is I chair an organisation called Sparks in Scotland, which is SPARQS. It's one of these really annoying things where the thought of that clever title, you know, Sparks, it sets learning alight and so on, but it's very clumsy. It's student participation in Quality Scotland. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about just now is from our work in Sparks. And if you want to look at their website, if you just Google Sparks, SPARQS, you will see all of this in much more detail. And Sparks is an organisation we set up about 5 years ago. It is, as the name suggests, it is all about engaging students in quality. It does not cost a lot of money. I think in our terms, the Sparks annual budget is less than £500,000 a year. For that, they have a director, an assistant director, and some junior staff. And what they do is they started off by providing training for students to become involved in quality processes in the universities. They then moved on to training the trainers, so that they trained trainers within the universities, so these trainers could then go on and train students within their own campuses. And they've moved beyond that now, and they run seminars and produce materials, run focus groups on the nature of being a student in higher education. And that's something that we take for granted. I don't know as much as I would like to know about the school system in Iceland. But I know our own school system suffers a bit from students learning what they're told to learn, and I use learn in inverted commas. They learn what they need to learn to pass exams, but actually they haven't reflected at all on the nature of learning, on how they learn, on what's effective learning for them. It's like, I'm very struck by the parallel again with music. You know, you tell young kids, go and practice your violin, and you put your earplugs in while they do it. But 99% of the time, kids actually don't know how to practice. And if they did know how to practice, they would achieve far more in the time available. And similarly, I think the case is, if students knew how they learned, how they learned effectively, they would get far more out of the experiences that you offer them. But so Sparks about 2 years ago, undertook a major survey of all of the colleges, the further education colleges as well as the universities, talked to all the student bodies about what they thought, and the academics, about what they thought the key elements of student engagement were. And just very briefly running through some of the headlines, and there's nothing terribly startling about this until I think you begin to put them all together and the picture it builds of an institution. It was key for effective engagement that students actually felt part of an environment that they thought was supportive. And there are a whole host of different examples that were given in this. It included things like activities where institutions developed relationships with students before they actually arrived, pre-admissions. And actually in some, I know the situation for the University of Iceland as a public university is slightly different in these contexts. But a great many of our universities in the UK, and even more so in the States, are now putting a great deal of effort into what they call transitions. Transition from school to university, or for community college to university. Because a lot of students are lost in that transition. They either don't manage to make it effectively, or they don't manage to make it at all. So building that relationship before they get to university is important. One of the examples we got in Canada from the University of Guelph in its campus in Toronto, they put a lot of effort into this pre-admissions linking between people who applied, after they applied, before they arrived. There was a lot of contact with the students, a lot of contact with the students' families, so that before they arrived, the students actually felt they were coming to an institution that was going to support their learning. So a variety of induction activities, student associations, clubs and societies, volunteering, mentoring and central support services, very importantly the welfare services, engagement with alumni, practical arrangements such as transport, financial support, childcare, and so on. Now, I know you may well sit there and say, look, times are hard in Iceland. Of course we would like to provide childcare. And yes, times are hard, but we do have to look at what we can do most effectively with the resources at our disposal. To students, and we talked to a group of Icelandic students, including but the University of Iceland, but from other institutions as well, about a fortnight ago. And one of the things that was of great concern to them was about this welfare support that surrounded them when they were at their institution. I mean, we tend to see these, well, some of us tend to see these things as at the periphery. But if we're thinking seriously of students engaging with us, students don't come with a head and no body. They come with a head, their body, and all the trials and tribulations of being the real people that they are. And it's about engaging with these real people. So about a supportive environment. It's about helping students to engage with their own learning. It's about devising learning structures that are really appropriate for your students. The easiest thing, and again we all do it, and I need to keep reminding myself not to do it. You think of the student you would like to have, and you design the learning experience for that person, rather than the students who are actually in front of you. And one of the things that woke me up to that was, I worked for a spell for the Open University in the UK, which has entirely open entry. People come with doctorates, they come with undergraduate qualifications, they come having failed every school exam that they ever sat in life, probably 40 years ago. They come from a whole variety of different backgrounds. And I was teaching on the foundation course, the first course they did in social sciences. And I remember my first exposure to economics, and it was about studying, is economics an art or a science? I had no idea what an art was or a science was. What the Open University did was to say it spent its first month in this programme on a course unit called The Limits of Everyday Thinking. And it was absolutely wonderful. It started off with problems in society that were very current at the time. There were three, I can't remember what the third one was. The first two were unemployment and crime. And started off by just saying, well, what is everyday thinking about crime, for example? And they had some source material from newspapers, some of from the full spectrum of the press, some of the sort of cheap and nasty press, and some of the so-called quality press. And it said to the students, well, what are the problems with these interpretations? What are the limits of everyday thinking in terms of trying to explain crime? And of course you get the extreme right-wing press saying, sort of, hang them, chop their hands off, lock them up for life, and so on. I said, well, let's try and sort of stand back a wee bit from this and say, well, how can we collect evidence on the nature of criminal behaviour? And what different kind of perspectives might we bring to bear in this? So, from a sociological perspective, of course, I didn't talk in that kind of language. They would say, well, it's to do with the nature of society, the unequal opportunities that some people have within society, the unequal access to resources, and so on. And if you break down by class, by background, by educational background, the nature of criminals, then the evidence is this. Is it true when you see the banner headlines in the press, crime is escalating beyond all proportions, you should not go out at night, lock yourselves up, get extra security in your house, etc., etc. What does the evidence tell us? And it then went through the process of collecting statistics on criminals. And just through that kind of process, and then you could look at the economists, and they came out rather poorly in this because folk did not find them at all convincing. Of course, the economists said, well, you could look at this as entirely rational behaviour. That's always the starting place for economists. We have rational economic man. You weigh up your pros and cons. If I go and work and I have no skills, I'll get the basic pay if I'm lucky. I'll struggle. Whereas if I go and rob a bank, okay, the probabilities are I might get caught, but there's just a chance I'll get away with it. So it's a rational decision. And you look at the psychologists. What are they telling us? Well, the psychologists can provide a whole host of different kind of insights into individual problems and explanations for behaviours and so on. But it was a very, very skillfully put together series of case studies. And at the end of that, at the end of the first month of study, people actually understood what the nature of social sciences was, what the nature of social science investigation was, the importance of evidence, the importance of competing perspectives. It was wonderful. And by the end of a year doing multidisciplinary studies in social sciences, I would have, and indeed I did, put any of these students straight into the second year of any university programme on any of the major social science disciplines. The bits they hadn't studied, they would catch up with very quickly. But actually they would understand their disciplines far better than my students who'd gone through the traditional introduction to economics in their first year, or whatever it was. So students engaging with their own learning, designing learning programmes that are important, that are relevant for the students that you have. Research, teaching linkages, workplace relevance, projects, induction to learning programmes, how to become a successful learner, university facilities that promote independent learning, academic mentoring, including peer mentoring, personal development planning, the development of graduate skills, academic societies, the development of opportunities for student choice. All of these things are parts of the students engaging with their own learning. Students, thirdly, working with their institution in shaping the direction of learning. And this is not just about getting feedback from students. Of course, it's partly about that. It's about what happens to it. It's about how students get involved in it. You've just been through 3 years now of subject level reviews over the university. And I would have to say, they're very good. I read them all. They're very good. The real question is, so what? Do they say, oh, that was fine. It's a good bit of medicine. I feel better for having done that. And on we go. Sit in a drawer and 5 years' time we'll pull it out when it's time to do the next review. Or are you now saying, that was important. What that review showed up is X, Y, and Z. We really do need to fix that. And okay, the university does not have a lot of money just now, and getting that new laboratory, we can't do. There is no money for it. But how can we make the existing laboratory better? How can we use electronic facilities to help get round some of these problems? How can we recluster the curriculum to make it more accessible to the students? How can we deal with the problem that the students are raising of too little choice? How can we deal with the problem the students raised of bias in the perspectives that we're using? Is there a real problem there? How do we deal with it? What are we going to do? Who do we want to benchmark ourselves against? How are we going to get there? And so on. It's what we do with them. It's getting the real involvement of students alongside us as we work with this. I'm sorry, I'm now slightly over time. I'll round up in 5 minutes, Magnus. Is that okay? Formal mechanisms of quality assurance, all of that sort of follows on. And it's not just about gathering student opinion, it's making sure that we have the student voice in debates, making sure that students are able to negotiate outcomes along with the rest of the academic community. It's very easy to be, and I'm sure it doesn't happen very much here, but it is very easy to be patronising and to think, well, we've got a student in that committee, that's fine. But it's not fine. It's not fine. I mean, the academics have been at this business for decades in many cases, and that's great. But how's the student to be supported? And I can't say how passionately I believe this. You have wonderful students in Iceland. We have students in our reviews, and they have been so impressive. The first student, indeed, one of my colleagues, as you know, Barbara Brittingham's from the quality agency in New England, and at the end of the week of working with the student member of our team, she persuaded the student to then go on to doctoral studies at MIT, which just happened to be in her bailiwick, which I thought was a bit unfair of her to use this pressure. But I mean, the student was so impressive. And the thing is, it's not just that one. All the students we have worked with have been of a similar quality. They have a great deal to contribute. We have gained hugely from working with them, and it is very clear that you also find the same. So the formal mechanisms right through the institution to the highest level of seriously engaging our students in the processes, and also engaging them at a national level. We had to fight a bit to get that happening properly in Scotland. It's not fully there yet. It's slightly further behind that, I would say, in England, and we're getting there, I think in Iceland. All the national committees where policy, educational policy is being debated, the students should be present. They should have a voice. And to bring all of this about, there has to be a variety of different features. There has to be a culture within the institution of engagement. It has to permeate the institution from top to bottom. It's not about a bit of tokenism. It's not about saying, well, student engagement, yes, that happens in the department round the corner in room 503. That's a student engagement centre. The student engagement centre is the front door as soon as they come into the university and beforehand. Students genuinely being treated as partners, not as token representatives. That we respond to the real diversity of the students that we have. We try to engage with them at times and in places and in ways appropriate for them. There's no point in running all of our societies in the evening if the majority of students in that particular programme have got significant childcare responsibilities. We've got to find ways around that, and so on. We've got to seriously value the student contribution. It is about enhancement and change rather than problem solving. We often think, well, there's a particular issue we've got to solve. Let's get a group of students together to address this question. That is okay, but that is not what student engagement is about. Student engagement is about the systematic involvement of the students. And in order to have that, they need to be supported in a variety of ways. They need to have time to do it. In some cases, the role of sabbatical officers is extremely important. Small amounts of resource can go a long, long way in terms of helping us. Where does all that take us to get to my conclusions? Well, it takes us to a rather kind of messy place. There's no neat and tidy conclusions to this. But reflecting back then on the question that Magnus posed me at the outset, he said, could you talk about the role of students? And that's what I've tried to do. But I've tried to do it by saying we can't really talk about the role of students without thinking very carefully about the nature of learning and teaching in higher education. This is, although the private-public mix of universities brings different dimensions, it does not alter the basic relationship, I don't think, between students and their institutions, between partnerships and learning. And all of this is not to deny that looking through the prism of the student as consumer has no validity. It does have some validity, but it is to assert that the nature of higher education, if you like, the product, is not amenable really to a market analysis. And the context in which learning in higher education is produced, the so-called market, it's so full of imperfections in the economist terms that consumer market analysis has, to my mind, very, very little validity. Higher education, in its fullest sense of the term, is a public good. And if we accept all of this, then the concept of student as co-producer rather than the student as consumer king should have a powerful bearing on how we arrange our structures and provisions within the university. Securing an effective student engagement in our affairs moves from the periphery to the very centre of our considerations. It moves, again, in our unfortunate modern jargon, it moves from the bottom of our risk register to the very top of our institutional risk register. Thank you very much for your attention.